Hakata Bay, August 1281. You are a soldier on a ship, and the storm has been going for hours. The wind is tearing, not pushing, tearing, at everything it can find. You grip the deck because the deck won't stay flat. The commander next to you goes over the side. You watch it happen. There is nothing you can do. You can hear men in the water. You cannot see them. You can hear them. 140,000 men are in this bay. Soldiers and sailors, conscripts from across the empire. Men who, 2 years ago, won one of the greatest naval battles in Asian history. The bay is killing them. The man who sent them here is in his palace in Dardu, 1,500 kilometers away, waiting for a victory report that will never come. His name was Kublai Khan, one of the greatest administrators of the medieval world. The man who conquered China. What you are about to learn is not the story of a battle lost to a storm. It is the story of why the storm was always coming. By 1279, Kublai Khan had done something no Mongol before him had ever managed. He conquered China, not raided it, not extracted tribute from its borders. He absorbed the most populous civilization on Earth, restarted its entire administrative machine, and governed an empire of 60 to 80 million people. He introduced paper money, merchants across the empire trading pieces of mulberry bark paper instead of coins. He built a relay system of horse stations stretching across a continent, so a message could cross his empire in days. He took the same provincial structure, the same ministries, the same system of officials and records that Chinese dynasties had used for centuries, and made it run again under Mongol authority. The dynasties that came after him, including the ones that despised everything Mongol, kept using that same skeleton. This is not a reckless man. This is one of the greatest administrators in the history of the world. So why did this man, this exact man, look at a failed 1274 invasion of Japan, where a storm had already killed 13,000 of his soldiers, and come back 7 years later with a bigger fleet, a tighter deadline, and worse ships? It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't simple arrogance. The answer starts in 1215 with the most terrifying bloodline in human history. 1215, Kublai Khan is born the fourth son of Tolui, grandson of Genghis Khan. Think about what that means. Genghis Khan had, by this point, killed more people than any single event in recorded history. He had turned the known world into a map of ash and tribute. His name wasn't just a name, it was a warning. The expected path was simple. Ride, conquer, kill, move. The steppe was home. Permanent structures were weakness. Mobility was power. That was what the bloodline demanded. Kublai's mother, Sorghaghtani Beki, was shrewd enough to see further. She raised all 4 of her sons to think about what comes after the campaign. To govern, not just conquer. That was the lesson she gave them all. In the 1230s, Kublai is given control of a district in North China. His subordinates have been squeezing it too hard. Peasants are abandoning their fields. The land is dying. He pulls back the demands, lets it recover, watches it produce more than the extraction ever had. He works with advisors like Liu Bingzhong, who push him toward running territories with officials, records, and the structured machinery of a settled state. The method works. He keeps using it. His younger brother Arik takes the same mother's lesson and draws the opposite conclusion. Govern well, yes, but govern as a Mongol, through tribute, through personal loyalty, through the traditions of the steppe. Not through Chinese officials and Chinese methods. Never that. Then Kublai meets Chabi. Chabi is the daughter of Anshan, a prince of the Kongirad, one of the most powerful Mongol lineages in the empire, so closely tied to the Genghisid ruling family it had provided wives to Genghis Khan himself. Steppe-born, Buddhist in faith, sharp enough to operate at the center of a Chinese imperial court. She understands both worlds the way Kublai needs someone to. She doesn't resolve the tension between them. She steadies him inside it. She is the person who can reach him when no one else can. Because the brother was coming. In 1259, Mongol Khan, the eldest brother, Great Khan since 1251, dies on campaign in southern China. There is no named successor. When the news reaches Kublai, he is in the south too, commanding the very campaign Mongol came down to lead. He has to make a choice, press forward or abandon everything and ride north. Mongol had placed Arik Boke, the youngest brother, in command of Karakoram, the original Mongol capital, before marching south. When Mongol dies, Arik is already there, sitting in the seat of traditional Mongol power, surrounded by the steppe elites who believe the succession is obvious. Chabi gets word first. Her message south to Kublai is urgent. Arik is moving to declare himself Great Khan. Abandon the campaign. Ride north now, or it is over. Kublai abandons the campaign. He rides north. At this point, Kublai is based at Xanadu when not in the field, a capital he built deliberately to straddle both worlds, Chinese architecture and Mongol steppe tradition under the same roof, a permanent city that still faced the grassland. He hunts. He holds Mongol court ceremonies alongside Chinese ones. He is genuinely both. But to the steppe elites watching him govern, it is his methods that draw quiet unease. Not the city. The way he runs it, with officials, records, and the machinery of a settled state that looks increasingly like a Chinese imperial administration operating inside a Mongol empire. In May 1260, Arik convenes his Kurultai at Karakoram and is declared Great Khan by the Traditionalist Assembly. In June, Kublai convenes his own rival Kurultai at Xanadu, backed by the armies, grain supply, and revenues of his territories. Kaidu, Ogedei's grandson and heir to the line Genghis Khan himself had designated to rule, stands on Arik's side. Two great Khans, one empire. Now Arik's faction states what the steppe world has been thinking. The argument: Kublai has drifted toward the other side. He governs from permanent cities with Chinese officials and Chinese methods. He is building something that looks and operates like a Chinese dynasty. He has not abandoned the steppe entirely, but he is moving away from it, and the direction is unmistakable. What he is becoming is not what a Khan is supposed to be. Think about what it means when the men rallying against you, men who know your family, who rode under the same Khans, stand in assembly and declare that the ruler you have become is a betrayal of everything your bloodline stands for. That is the question, not a debate, a verdict. You are not what you are supposed to be. The civil war runs 4 years. Kublai wins not through superior legitimacy, but through superior resources. He controls the supply lines, starves Arik's army, and accepts his surrender in 1264. Then he does something that tells you everything about the wound. He spares him. After 4 years of civil war, after his own brother tried to take everything, Kublai does not execute him. He purges Arik's key backers, but Arik himself he keeps alive, under guard, in a room in Kublai's empire. For 2 years, Arik Boke dies in 1266, in custody. Possibly starvation, possibly Kublai's quiet arrangement. The record leaves the gap open. What we know is this: Kublai could not give the order cleanly, so his brother stayed and died without ever changing his position. In 1271, Kublai proclaims the Yuan dynasty. He keeps Xanadu as his summer capital. He keeps Mongol elites in military command. He is still genuinely both things. But the proclamation sends a message the steppe world reads in one direction only. Kaidu, Ogedei's grandson, who will spend the rest of Kublai's life contesting the steppe frontier, picks up Arik's argument and never puts it down. And Kublai is frozen. He cannot ride west to silence those princes. His armies are the only thing holding Yuan authority together inside China, and after years of Song conquest, there is no surplus. He cannot go back to the steppe full-time. The empire requires him in Dadu. The stalemate at the frontier grinds on, a living monument to the accusation he cannot answer. Those years, careful, measured, the balance held, have Chabi's fingerprints on them. She is the person who keeps the verdict from swallowing him whole. Then Japan refuses. Here is something worth thinking about. Under the Mongol tradition established by Genghis Khan, the pattern was direct. One message, one refusal, then war. But Kublai sends envoys to Japan again and again, multiple missions between 1266 and 1268 alone, asking for submission, waiting for acknowledgement, trying once more after each refusal. He is acting like a Chinese-style emperor managing a tributary system, not like a steppe warlord whose first response to defiance is fire. Ask yourself, does that pattern look more like a Mongol Khan, or like the Chinese-style ruler Arik said he had become? But Japan will have to wait. There is a war to finish first. The key to southern China is a city called Xiangyang. Twin fortresses, Xiangyang and Fancheng, sit on opposite banks of the Han River, blocking the only viable route into the Yangtze Basin and the Song heartland. From 1268, Kublai lays siege, building a river fleet, stringing blockade chains across the Han, slowly cutting the twin fortresses off from resupply by water. The Song run supply convoys through under cover of darkness. Kublai's fleet meets them. Year after year, the grip tightens. Because Xiangyang is not a city you take with cavalry, it is a city you starve. Then Kublai imports Muslim siege engineers from Persia, specialists who bring the knowledge and expertise to construct counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling stone beyond any range the defenders have seen. The walls that have held for years begin to come down. Fancheng falls, then Xiangyang surrenders in 1273. The Yangtze opens, the Song heartland lies exposed. Patience, control of the water, the right tools brought from the other side of the world. That is what won it. But the steppe is still watching. Kaidu is still raiding. The verdict is still alive, and Japan has been refusing long enough. With Xiangyang secured and the southern Song's collapse now inevitable, Kublai decides to test Japan's resolve. Autumn 1274, 30,000 men, Korean and Chinese soldiers, Mongol commanders, gunpowder weapons. The Yuan forces break the Japanese defensive lines with explosive bombs and massed arrow fire. The samurai, steeped in a tradition of honorable single combat, are thrown into confusion by a force that fights as a single organism and hurls things that detonate. The landing succeeds. The inland push stalls immediately. Kyushu is dense and wooded, cut with rivers, perfect for the guerrilla resistance the Japanese run from every ridge and tree line. Supply lines from the fleet cannot sustain an overland push. The commanders pull back to the ships. A typhoon finds the clustered fleet at anchor that night. Ships moored together destroy each other in the waves. 13,000 men die, not from Japanese swords, but from weather and from applying land campaign logic to an ocean. Back in Dadu, advisors counsel against a second attempt. The costs, the terrain, the difficulty. Kublai silences some of them. He calls it bad luck and insufficient force. A larger fleet would have held. There is unfinished business in China first. Japan will wait. What would you do in this exact moment? 13,000 men are dead. Your advisors are telling you to stop. But you believe, genuinely believe, that a bigger force would have held. Do you go back, or do you let it go? I read every single comment, so drop your answer below. And if you've stayed this far, you're not here by accident. You care what history actually did to the people trapped inside it, not just what the textbook says happened afterward. That makes you one of the remnants, the viewers who want the buried chapters, not the safe summary. Like and subscribe so the algorithm knows these stories still matter. Back to Kublai Khan, March 1279, the naval battle of Yamen. The last Song claimants, 1,000 ships, a child emperor, soldiers and civilians in the hundreds of thousands, make their final stand in a chain formation off the Guangdong coast. Kublai's fleet closes around them. Encircled and burning, the Song loyalists choose death over surrender. The child emperor dies in the water. 3 centuries of Song dynasty end in a single afternoon. All of China belongs to Kublai. Stop and consider what this means. Not just the territory, not just the tax revenue. Kublai Khan, the man Arik Boke's faction called a Mongol who had become a Chinese emperor, has done what no Mongol before him ever managed. He has absorbed the most sophisticated civilization on Earth and made it run under Mongol authority, Mongol elites at the top, Chinese administrative machinery underneath. The verdict said that model was a betrayal. He has just proven it can do what pure Mongol force never could alone. This should be the moment the verdict goes quiet. But Japan is still there, and so is Kaido. After the 1274 invasion failed, Kublai sent envoys to Japan in 1275 and again in 1279, demanding capitulation. Both missions were beheaded on Japanese orders, 2 sets of ambassadors killed, each execution a public declaration that Japan did not recognize Kublai's authority to demand anything. And on the western frontier, Kaido's raids keep coming, each one a steppe-lord saying the same thing in a different language. The greatest empire on earth is not led by a real Khan. Japan's contempt and Kaido's raids are telling Kublai the same thing Arik's faction said in 1260. Conquering China has not closed the question. It has made it louder. He looks east. He decides he has already mastered the sea. And this time, he is not willing to wait 5 years. The Second Armada, the largest naval force ever assembled in the pre-modern world. 140,000 men, roughly 4,000 ships, 2 fleets converging on Kyushu in a pincer. The answer the dead cannot argue with. There is a constraint he cannot change. He cannot send his Mongol cavalry. Soldiers of the open battlefield, not the ocean, and the only visible guarantee of Yuan authority inside China. Move them onto ships for Japan, and the empire loses its spine. So the Armada is built from the one resource Kublai has in unlimited supply: the conquered. Chinese conscripts, Korean laborers, the people his grandfather's generation killed, now assembled to purchase the steppe credibility their emperor cannot earn any other way. To prove he is a true Mongol, he will sacrifice the lives of the people his brother accused him of caring too much about. Now ask yourself this: was it the confidence of a man who had just conquered China? Or the urgency of an aging ruler who feels the verdict closing in and needs an answer before time runs out? History doesn't say. What it does say is the deadline was 1 year. At Xiangyang, he waited 5. The order travels down through governors, through shipyard supervisors, through every official who has watched Kublai remove men for raising the wrong concerns. Korean and Chinese commanders who questioned the campaign found their objections unwelcome. According to Korean tradition, Kim Pangyeong warned against the second invasion and paid for it with disgrace, if not his life. That chain of command does what it always does under rulers with absolute power and impossible deadlines. It complies, not by solving the problem, by hiding it. You are a master shipwright in southern China. You have spent your working life building ocean vessels. You know what a ship needs: a deep keel, seasoned timber, mast fittings built for open water. You have seen what happens to men who deliver bad news to this court. So you sign the quota. You meet the deadline. You build what you can build fast. What gets built from the Yangtze region and the southern shipyards, confirmed by Chinese records and the underwater archaeology at Takashima, are flat-bottomed river vessels. No deep keels, recycled timber, weak mast fittings, workhorses of the inland waterways, reclassified as warships, sent into the Hakata Bay. The men who built them knew exactly what they were constructing and exactly why it was wrong. They built them anyway, because the alternative was facing their emperor without a completed quota. 1 year, one deadline, ships that would not survive a storm. And the storm was coming. 1281, Hakata Bay. The second invasion has been fighting for 7 weeks. The Japanese used every year since 1274. Defensive walls rebuilt along the Hakata coastline. Tactics rebuilt around Yuan weapons. Small fast boats built specifically to raid Yuan vessels in darkness. The beachhead is contested. The fleet holds position offshore. Forced by the Japanese night raids, the commanders chain the ships together. Hull to hull, a floating wall the raiders cannot easily board. Given what they are facing, it is the right call. Given what those ships were made of, it kills everyone. The typhoon hits in the night. Flat-bottomed hulls grip almost nothing against ocean waves. They roll sideways immediately. The chains pull ship against ship as they roll, while the recycled timber and weak mast fittings meet forces they were never built to handle. The storm drives the collapse. The chains make sure it spreads. What the storm doesn't finish, the Japanese do, waiting on the shore, cutting down survivors who reach the beach. Of the 140,000 men who entered Hakata Bay, only a fraction makes it home. Would better ships have changed the outcome? Probably not. This typhoon was large enough and violent enough that even an ocean-ready fleet would have taken catastrophic losses. The bay was too confined, the fleet too massive, the storm too sustained for good hulls alone to save them. The difference is in the scale of the slaughter, not the result. Better ships would have left more survivors. They would not have left Japan conquered. But here is what matters for our story. Kublai Khan did not sacrifice 140,000 men because he miscalculated the weather. He sacrificed them because he needed an answer, and the need for the answer overrode every lesson his own victories had taught him. The ships were just the evidence. To answer a verdict about whether he was a true Mongol, Kublai Khan sent the conquered people his brother accused him of caring too much about into a bay in ships built to a 1-year deadline. And the steppe lords looked at the wreckage and still said no. Arik Boke had been dead for 15 years. His verdict was still standing. That same year, Chabi died. The woman who steadied him through the Civil War, the Yuan proclamation, the Song campaigns, every moment when the two halves of his identity pulled in opposite directions. The person whose fingerprints were on the best years of his reign. Gone in the same year as the fleet, as if the world had decided to take everything at once. He begins to eat, he begins to drink. He stops appearing at court the way he used to. The government keeps running. It was built well enough to run without him, but the man who built it is somewhere else now. He had a son, Zhenjin, Chabi's son, being prepared to carry everything forward. The Mongol authority and the Chinese statecraft, the precise balance that only Kublai had ever learned to hold. 5 years later, in 1286, Zhenjin dies too. He keeps going, because stopping means the verdict wins. In 1293, 12 years after Hakata Bay, it happens again. The king of Java, ruler of Singasari, had refused Kublai's demand for tribute. Then he did something that made refusal feel mild. He had Kublai's envoy's face branded, mutilated, a deliberate humiliation of the Yuan court, sent back in the form of a scarred man. The same pattern. Another ruler. Another envoy sent, mutilated, and returned. Kublai sends a fleet, 20,000 men this time, a fraction of Hakata Bay, but the same answer to the same need. It fails. Disease, a betrayed alliance, a forced withdrawal. The verdict still unanswered. He is carried through the halls of his palace in a chair because he can no longer walk. The gout has his joints. Around him, silk curtains, warm rooms, palace servants, the whole apparatus of a sedentary court. Is this the proof Arik Boke's faction pointed at in 1260? You decide. On February 18th, 1294, Kublai Khan dies in Dadu, 78 years old, unable to move. Surrounded by everything his brother said would consume him. He conquered China. He built one of the most sophisticated governments the medieval world had ever seen. He governed 60 million people across a territory larger than anything that had existed before. He also sent 140,000 men to die in a bay in Japan, trying to answer one question. The verdict came from a younger brother who rode with him, campaigned under the same Khan, and then looked at the direction Kublai was heading and refused to accept it. Kublai kept him alive after the war, under guard for 2 years, and his brother died anyway. He died without ever changing his position. The answer was never in Japan. You cannot prove who you are to a dead man. And somewhere in Hakata Bay, the timbers of the ships that tried are still there, still in the water, still being found. The storm didn't sink Kublai Khan. The verdict did. He just never got to decide when it was final. If you stayed to the end, you care what history actually did to the people trapped inside it. That makes you one of the remnants. Like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our next story.